Welcome to NuclearCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Welcome to our latest episode of NuclearCast. I am your host, Adam Lowther, and today my guest is Zach Kallenborn. For those of you that may already know Zach, you know his work on drones. He is one of the foremost experts on drones, and he writes really good stuff. So Zach is a policy fellow at the Center for Security Policy Studies at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He is a research affiliate at the Unconventional Weapons and Technology Division of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, START. That's at the University of Maryland. He's a senior consultant at ABS Group, and he's a fellow at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. He has a lot of hats. So welcome to the show, Zach.
Thanks for having me.
So the reason I wanted you on the show is because you were clearly one of the brightest minds on drones, and you think more broadly and creatively about drones. And as we're a show, NuclearCast, is we talk a little bit about nuclear power, but we primarily talk about nuclear weapons, nuclear strategy, adversaries, that kind of thing. And I thought it would be great to talk about drones and how drones might play a role in the future of deterrence, of delivering weapons, of trying to defeat weapons, all sorts of ways in which they can play a role. And you were obviously the natural choice for this. So before we get into all of those creative and interesting things that people are like, wow, I hadn't thought of that. Where are we with drones today? How do you see them being used in Ukraine? Where should our listeners, what do they need to know about drones?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great place to start, because the reality is, like, the role of drones has been changing very, very rapidly in a short period. I think most people's conceptions of drones have been really solidified, with sort of the war on terror, thinking about like the MQ-9 Reaper as like, okay, these are these big systems that like hang out in Afghanistan and blow the crap out of terrorists. But increasingly, it's not like that's certainly still a role for drones, but we've seen a massive broadening of the use of drones in conflict, not only for like big states like the United States, but also like smaller ones as well at a huge scale. Washington Post, for example, just ran a piece, I believe earlier today, saying that like the current Ukraine-Russia conflict is like the first real drone war. I don't know if I really buy that framing, because drones have been used for a while for a number of reasons. But I think the point is right in that, like, we've seen drones being used against great powers, against the Russia. Well, maybe not so great based on their success in Ukraine, but, a more traditional great power. And that's significant because previously a lot of analysts believed that drones, they would be useless there. They just get shot down. And we do see some of that. But nonetheless, they played a major role. And interestingly, they've been playing a major role across like the full spectrum of conflict. Like we've seen, yes, bigger drones like the Bayraktar TB2, the Turkish supplied drone that's carried out a wide variety of strikes against.
Can I ask you a question about that drone?
Yes, please.
Do you know the song? Because it's one of my favorites. It's on my iTunes list. Do you know it word for word? Be honest.
Word for word, no. I have listened to it quite a lot. Like that for a while, that was my wake-up music. Like, all right, let's get pumped for the day and sing about the Bayraktar. So yeah, no, that's a fantastic one.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. Yeah, it's fantastic. So you see everything from like the big Bayraktars destroying stuff to like these little tiny quadcopters that are literally commercial drones that you can find off the shelf that are being used to help guide artillery and create much more significant damage. We're also seeing not only that spectrum of aerial drones, but we're also seeing cross-domain as well. We've seen, I believe Russia has done a little bit of work with unmanned ground vehicles that can destroy mines. Likewise, Ukraine just carried out a really fascinating attack where they used, I believe it was 7 unmanned surface vehicles and 9 aerial drones, all operating together to carry out attacks against the Russian Black Sea fleet. And it's not clear that it caused like tremendous amounts of damage, but theoretically they could. Like, you have those mass attacks where you get hit from a whole bunch of different directions at the same time. But Russia's behavior has already changed. They've moved a lot of their ships to port. They've had a bunch of defenses, that type of thing. That's just what we've seen in the past like several months.
Sure.
A couple of notable other developments beyond that is that we're also seeing much greater uses of autonomy. So similarly in the Ukraine, some folks affiliated with the Ukraine military noted that they're entirely capable of using fully autonomous drones. That is, drones that like have automated target recognition and selection. Say, all right, that's a tank, that's a person, blow that up. They admitted that they haven't used it, and that's good because I think there's a lot of flaws that we can sort of dive into a little bit more fully here. But we've also seen the use of drone swarms, not in Ukraine, but a drone swarm being a collection of drones that all operate together as a collective system where they communicate between one another. So Israel actually used the first drone swarm in combat May of last year to carry out attacks on various terrorists in that region. So just bottom line, what you see is massive use of drones across the spectrum, all domains, everything from big systems, little systems, working in collaboration, potentially multiple domains simultaneously. And what's more, the technology is relatively simple, right? This is like Ukraine is hardly like a great power. That said, we've certainly supplied quite a lot of this technology, but nonetheless, they can field this technology at relatively small power. So I think that's what we can expect to see over the future. So it's natural to think about, well, what does this mean across the spectrum of competition to include nuclear deterrence?
Yeah, it's a great, it's funny you mentioned drone swarms, and I'm an avid baseball fan. And so I live in Kansas City, so I go to quite a few Royals games. And after one of the shows one night, they had a drone show. And it was amazing to see these drones operating and performing a light show and, creating different pictures and the Royals sign and all sorts of stuff. And I thought, and it was hundreds of drones. So I thought for these drones to be able, and they all operate autonomously. And I thought, man, if for military purposes, this can be problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to put my expert hat on and pick apart that a little bit. So I think those like examples like those drone shows are really fascinating because they do show absolutely, as you said, like that potential, like what happens if we have tons and tons of drones doing all these complex things. In the case of those drone shows, most of those are operating based on pre-programmed routes. So like each of those drones is following, I believe it's like a GPS route that says like, go here, go here, go here, that type of thing. They aren't necessarily like communicating and collaborating. That said, for a military purpose, depending on what you're trying to do, like some of that pre-programmed things, that might just be fine. Like if you're hitting a relatively static target where you know where it is, just bombard it with a whole bunch of drones. Like that might be fine. But I think the real complexity comes when you start getting that communication where you get sort of that dynamic engagement. And states are absolutely going in that direction. Naval Postgraduate School, for example, is looking at what if you have swarms of literally hundreds of thousands of drones? Like what would it take to build that? And equally important, counter that.
So as we think about drones, I mean, I wrote an article in like 2008, I think, is one of the first articles I wrote when I was working for the Air Force. And my argument was take the Navy's UCAS, which was a fairly big system, and put a B-61 on it, and then use it as a stealthy, small nuclear bomber that can penetrate. And we've come a long way since then. Our capabilities have come a long way, but this idea that drones can play a role in, nuclear deterrence or nuclear warfighting, or it's clearly a big deal. So as you think about drones, because you think about drones more than just about anybody, how do you see drones playing a role in sort of nuclear deterrence or warfighting, or whether it's detection or there's a whole host of roles it could potentially play?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think that's the reality of it is that potentially it can play every single role. Like that's one of the things I actually find fascinating about drones is that like there's so many potential applications. Go back to my point I was making earlier. You have drones across every single domain and potentially operating simultaneously with any conceivable payload. So I think just from a purely theoretical perspective, I think drones could apply for literally any potential nuclear mission. They could carry nuclear weapons themselves. We've seen some examples of that, particularly Russia's Poseidon nuclear torpedo, which occasionally is described as an unmanned undersea vehicle. The lines there are a little bit squishy, but nonetheless, some sensible people think it would consider that within the realm of drones because it's sort of maneuvering autonomously to some degree. So that's very plausible. You could also certainly see drones as sort of supporting more traditional delivery systems. One of the things that we've seen drones be very effective at is like serving as decoys, since a lot of these drone systems are relatively cheap. And certainly if that drone doesn't have a nuclear weapon on it, the loss of that relative to like a more advanced bomber, like, sure, that's great. If it triggers those air defenses and can either counter them or just, waste the munition, that can be really useful there. I think it also can be really useful as a defensive system to sort of attack both either being used against our delivery systems or used to attack others. So you mentioned like against ICBM forces and ground mobile systems. I think there's a potential there where, because theoretically you can imagine sort of drones sort of spreading out over an area, searching out like what exactly is going on. I think some of the challenge you're going to get with like the ground mobile ICBMs is sort of the stealth aspect of it. If there's like 500 drones flying around looking for ICBMs, like someone's probably going to notice. Whether they do anything about it, is going to be a question. But, depending on the timing, that may be more or less valuable. If you're anticipating some level of strike or you're worried about something happening, like it might be worth the risk to do so. But you can also imagine, doing so a little bit more stealthily. You have covert forces that maybe just have like a DJI quadcopter that's just sort of flying around, just kind of searching it out. Something like that might not even draw any attention. In fact, we've seen that quite a bit in the United States. Bangor Kitsap base in Washington, there's been a bunch of random drone sightings. No one really knows what exactly they are. I think it's quite plausible those are adversaries, taking a look at what's going on at the base and, looking at operations. And then, of course, more broadly, it's generally an intel sensor asset as well, just to see what exactly is going on. Because conceivably, a drone is just a platform, which means it can have any type of payload you want, from infrared to electro-optical to any other type of sensor that you might want. So I think conceivably you could have pretty much any role you could imagine that a platform would do. I think before I start, I'll turn it back over to you. I think one of the larger questions, and it's going to be really tough to deal with, is what is the relative value, right? Like just because it can be applied doesn't mean it's a good idea or that there aren't, better things that might do so. So like if we talk about delivery, some of the challenges you get is you then become potentially vulnerable to like electronic warfare, like, jamming that connection between the drone or manipulating any sort of autonomy or, cyber potential attacks. Those may be solvable problems, but they at least need to be solved if you're going to use it. And there may be systems that don't have those problems that may be preferable.
Well, this is a good spot to take a quick break. So you're listening to NucleCast with Zach Kallenborn, and we will be right back. This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the 15th Annual Nuclear Deterrence Summit. Come join NucleCast at the summit on February 13th through 15th, 2023 at the Hyatt Regency Crystal City, Arlington, Virginia. Industry and government experts will be discussing management of the nuclear security complex, stewardship of the nuclear stockpile, arms control negotiations, and strategic policy. Stop by the NucleCast booth to say hello. Executive producer Kimberly Charrington and I will be there interviewing guests for upcoming episodes. You can find a registration link to the Nuclear Deterrence Summit with a 15% discount on the NucleCast website at anwadeter.org/NucleCast. All right, and we're back with Zach Kallenborn. This is Adam Lowther, your host. So we're talking about the role that drones can play. And, you mentioned that there's a possibility versus, is this really a good idea? Is this feasible? Is this cost effective? We have all these questions. And the Air Force recently, they had, I'm probably getting the name wrong. I think it was like Trusted Wingman, or it was their Wingman program where they were going to pair drones with F-35s or other aircraft, to create your ability to engage in aerial combat. And I think the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, I read that program was canceled. So I don't know if you've seen this. It was in the last few days, I think. And
interesting.
So I if you haven't read it, we'll sort of skip it. But I saw it as an opportunity to really look at this question that you had of feasibility. And what might be a feasible, and the Air Force, obviously, assuming I read this correctly, in that they're saying some things we thought might be feasible, maybe they're not as feasible as we thought. And, so there's clearly concerns over the issues that you've raised. And I'm really interested in as you think about, like, I think in terms of ICBMs, for example, I might want a drone. ICBMs are pretty safe in, silo-based ICBMs. But I thought, what if, for example, I could set down an ICBM a drone, an explosive drone with a high explosive charge, set it down outside the fence, and then I wait till, the door blasts off. Yeah. And then maybe I pick it up off the grass and fly it in and explode it. Or, these are obviously, sort of pie in the sky thoughts. Or we mentioned attacking road mobile ICBMs, or, other things that you might be able to do. Do you envision sort of any of these abilities to, like take road mobile ICBMs? I could imagine the United States taking drones, because we, through satellite imagery, we sort of know where their hide sites and movement sites are for some of our adversaries, that you could put drones near those sites in woods or in, some sort of absolutely. Cover. Do you see any real possibility of these kinds of applications, or do you see any possibility of using, sort of a drone to deliver a nuclear weapon in a sort of a hard to hit target? Because there are some targets, the North Koreans are really good at this, where they put facilities on the sides of, mountains in valleys such that an ICBM can't hit them, so.
Yeah, I think absolutely. So I think there's a lot there that I want to sort of jump on. So I want to jump to the first, the Loyal Wingman program. So I didn't see that particular development, and that's a program I haven't been following too terribly closely, so I can't really talk too much about the specifics there. But I think you're right in that, like, it has relevance to sort of the potential, like, feasibility issue that is, and like, what is the actual value of these systems. So, like, in the Loyal Wingman, one of the parts that I liked about it is like, and similarly, why you value drones in general is that they're relatively cheap. That is, if you lose like the Loyal Wingman, you are also not losing a human pilot. That's, we care vastly more about. Likewise, not having that human means you can potentially make it much cheaper. That said, you have to consider like the ways in which it used. So like, how exactly did the Loyal Wingman, for example, support in like a dogfight or particular combat operations? What is the relative value that it provided that couldn't be in other places? By say, like, just having a more effective trained pilot, having longer range munitions, increased stealth capability, like any of the myriad ways that you can potentially improve a fighter jet. And then, of course, you have to think about like the logistics and management of that system. Like, okay, where does this come from? Like, is it? I can't remember exactly how the loyal wingman is deployed, but like, is this something that's like physically attached to the fighter jet? Is it like something that has to be launched and travels alongside? You know, those are all questions, and it's applicable to any type of drone or any type of application. So to your point about like, you know, you might be thinking pie in the sky, like to some extent, like I don't think that's a bad thing. Like it may very well turn out that like some of those applications, they may not really make much sense. But like personally, I think it's a mistake, a priori to assume that they can't or that they aren't worth at least considering. So like the example of like, okay, what if you have like that bomb laden drone to hit an ICBM? The immediate challenge that I see is like, okay, what happens like the timing of it, right? Like, because that's a pretty narrow window between like when the doors come off and when the ICBM launches and it's too high to hit with the drone. Like how big is that window? That goes beyond my level of expertise, but depending on what that looks like, if it's relatively big, like that might be a feasible thing. And honestly, I don't know how much time like a drone pilot would need to actually like get in there and do some damage. Like if it's only like 10 seconds, okay, yeah, that might be a little bit too imaginary. But like if you potentially have like 10, 15-minute type windows, like, yeah, that seems quite plausible.
Do you see drones being able to be fully autonomous with, you know, the requisite AI that they essentially are tasked with a mission, and then, you know, they're set forth to go, you know, hypothetically, if we want to, you know, embed drones in, you know, in North Korea, for example, to strike, you know, mobile ICBMs, that we can just put them there and we say, okay, well, listen, if you think somebody's has found you, blow up. If otherwise, wait. And then if, you know, until we give you the go order and then go, you know, then you're on your own to find the row mobile ICBM and attack it. Are we there yet with the technology, or are we still to where we definitely need drone pilots who are, you know, flying these drones and operating them? Or are we at a point where we can autonomously, you know, for example, there's a video on the internet where, you know, the little drones have targets and, you know, it's the human face and they go look for that person and then target that person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a yes and no to that. Like, can we do it? Yes. The question is how effectively and reliably can we do it? And that's the much more tricky question. Can we do it? Yes. Like, it's pretty simple. Like, if you look at sort of the facial recognition examples, and like machine vision, like the ability to recognize objects, absolutely, machines can do that. And that's not even really that hard. Like, I saw a video on LinkedIn the other day where like is literally a 10-year-old. He coded a machine vision system to classify his little Hot Wheels cars and not just like this is a car, but like the exact like model of like this is the car, right? So like the notion that we could recognize and detect ICBMs, ground mobile ones, 100% feasible. But the problem is doing so reliably, and particularly considering the incredible variation that you potentially run into in moving through a country. Everything from, you know, buildings, trees, what happens if it's foggy, it's rainy, what if there's different things that are like partially in the way, what if they have camouflage, you know, there's a bazillion potential variations. And so doing that reliably with low false positive rates, that becomes more the issue there. Right. So like there's been some looks that like actually my favorite one, OpenAI, which does some really advanced work in machine vision, where they have a classifier that recognizes with like 99% probability, like, OK, this is a Granny Smith apple when it showed like an apple. Right. But when they put a sticker on it that has the word iPad on it, it then classifies like at 88% likelihood that this is an iPad. So the point is like it's a relatively brittle system. And so how well that works in practice is a little bit iffy, especially if you're sort of removing that pilot. That said, you know, there's various ways you could imagine where pilots might still have a role, right? Where you have like special operations force, other covert type folks who are in the area who are potentially monitoring some of these video feeds to confirm like, okay, yeah, that actually is an ICBM. But that said, what you absolutely can do without too much difficulty is some of that, like what those drones shows is autonomously following like waypoints in navigation. So go point A to point B to point C, and like doing that part in North Korea, absolutely, that would be no issue at all. Outside of someone wondering like why is there a drone flying around, but like that part you could absolutely do.
Do you see? So part of deterrence is the idea that you're going to change somebody's risk calculations such that the risk is not worth the reward. Do you see drones as in we've been watching the role they played in Ukraine, and particularly for the Russians because they've been pretty successful against the Russians. But do you see them playing a role in reshaping the risk calculus when it comes to nuclear deterrence?
That's a big question. I don't think drastically. Like I think it'll have an effect, like absolutely, but I see drones as more sort of like a sideshow to like nukes and generally the types of things that we've done already. Like if we accept that North Korea can reasonably deter to some degree, like the United States based on its relatively limited arsenal, then like even meaningful enhancements of like drones, like does it really change the game, like our understanding of how like the nuclear deterrence interactions really change all that much? Probably not. That said, I do think there are some particularly important things that are very much at least worth concern and thinking about. The one that really strikes me is submarine warfare, and particularly reliability of second strike deterrence. Because submarines are hiding in the vastness of the ocean, and they hide because it's the relatively small size versus the vastness of the ocean. Plus various stealth characteristics and that sort of thing. But if you have a large number of distributed sensors and a large number of distributed platforms that can potentially search for them, that may change quite a bit. Now, of course, once you find the submarine, you have to be able to strike it. So it's not as simple. And the ocean is still massive. So even if you have a bunch of drones, like it's still going to be a challenge. But I do think that is an area of pretty serious concern, at least that bears looking at. So, for example, the United States has been developing the Sea Hunter drone. That is an autonomous unmanned surface vehicle. It's actually pretty much exactly what you're talking about with the for looking for land mobile ICBMs, except looking for submarines instead. Where this is a autonomous unmanned surface vehicle. I think it's about 140-ish feet long, so relatively small. But it can stay out in the ocean roughly 70 to 90 days without people actually supporting it. And its whole job is sort of to just roam around and look for submarines. And then when it finds a submarine, it just, follows them around. And then we can then track where those submarines go. So, theoretically, if you manage to track all submarines that are deployed at any one given time, then theoretically a first strike becomes possible to wipe out all nuclear forces if we know where all those are. Assuming again that we have the munitions to, hit those places before they potentially run away. So I think that's concerning, especially because, I think there are a number of trends that are heading in that direction. If we think about just big data and artificial intelligence, just generally, and the ability to process information, that absolutely supports building that awareness of not only the ocean, but just generally what's going on. And of course, we also have the ubiquity of satellites to be able to support that, as well as new sensor technology, advancing in quantum sensors that also potentially add that situational awareness and transparency. Actually, I'll plug a piece that CSIS did recently at Pony. I thought it was really fantastic, looking at the situational awareness that's going on, looking at reviewing multiple technologies, including but not limited to drones, to see noting that all their effects in building awareness of what's going on. So I think that's a fairly significant one to grapple with that has potentially big effects for larger nuclear deterrence dynamics.
Yeah, you mentioned the sea drones, and we've largely discussed, we've thought in terms of aerial drones, but the idea of disrupting American second strike assurity, because you have drones that can, with a simple torpedo can take out an SSBN. And it makes it very hard to be able to respond when you use a conventional munition to sink a submarine, to then use nuclear weapons in response is somewhat of a challenge to justify, particularly in a democracy like the United States. So that's a really good use. And then, we've not really even talked about land-based drones. So as we think about, aerial drones looking for and trying to destroy, I could easily see drones that are, made to look like rocks or other things that are mobile, but can sit and just wait. And then potentially they release some munition. They have a little rocket, they have, because to disable, a land-based ICBM or, a road mobile ICBM doesn't necessarily take a giant boom. Do you see their role as potentially being more on the defensive side of trying to destroy ICBMs, boomers, whatever, or do you see them being used in an offensive capacity?
Yeah, that's interesting. So that was the gist of an article that I put out for War on the Rocks on drone swarm implications for CBRNs, or looking at that. I can't remember exactly what we concluded around nukes specifically, but my inclination is that I think the more important implications are for defense. I think there is applications for offense, but again, it doesn't strike me as a drastic, real game changer there. I think the defense is really where many of the significant applications are at, especially since drones are just very cheap, which means inherently they somewhat favor the defense, because theoretically, like, even small states can get this type of capability. But of course, even within the defense capability, we also have to consider the responses to drones. Like, one of the things that I think is interesting, like we talk about sort of mobile ICBMs as well as submarines as well, why not just create fake drones that look like, nuke subs that are traveling around, because that makes it much more difficult. Or alternatively, what if you just have a drone that looks like a mobile ICBM? There's nothing actually in it. Maybe you got the ICBM is really just an inflatable balloon or whatever. But you just drive that around as like a drone. That even if there's nothing there, it at least complicates the targeting problem drastically, because you would have to know beforehand, okay, is that a decoy? Is that not a decoy? Before one is wanting to risk sort of letting the nuclear chain off the to go.
Yeah, I mean, and thinking in terms of the Ukraine conflict and the Russian threats to use, low yield sort of battlefield weapons, those are very clearly mobile systems most often, whether if it's a short range ballistic missile. And so to me, as much as the Ukrainians, for example, have been very good at striking Russian targets, that these, perhaps more so than strategic nuclear weapons, these short range battlefield nuclear weapons might be more susceptible to drone attack than, the larger, silo based or bomber based, drone systems or delivery systems.
Yeah, I think so. Especially if they're sort of interacting in relatively normal battlefield environments, then they're just as susceptible to the challenges that you run into in the battlefield, from, having that bear actor flying overhead and just blows it up. But I think also actually that brings up a really interesting issue as well, is sort of that ubiquity of drones and that awareness as well of just what's going on sort of in the battlefield. That's one of the things I found particularly fascinating about Ukraine, is not only just the use of drones just generally, but in particular the use of civilians, drones by civilians for information purposes. Like we've seen just on like Telegram, Twitter, folks where they just they're flying their personal drone around and they see Russian, movements and take pictures and collect video of like, oh, hey, here's a tank moving around, and then put it up and understand what's going on. So, to connect that to nukes specifically, okay, we can imagine that there's that mobile tactical nuke that's sort of driving around potentially, that might very well get captured by either drone, cell phone camera, something of that sort, and just upload on social media. So there's potentially greater awareness of those movements, which also, of course, makes it harder for, like, say, Russia to try to achieve like a stealthy attack on that, because like people are potentially watching it. Not impossible by no means, but you can at least have that much greater awareness of like, oh shit, there's a nuke driving around.
Yeah,
this could be a problem.
Now, unfortunately, we are out of time for this episode. Is there anything you want to leave the listeners with that you think they really have to know about when it comes to drones?
Yeah, I think the key issue that we really need to think about is just the creativity of it, and just thinking about drones have so many potential applications. I think it's incumbent on us to be willing to think broadly and creatively, and even coming up with, frankly, what might even be a dumb idea, but because it may turn out actually it's not really that dumb. We just haven't thought about it. Of course, the flip side of that is that when the rubber starts hitting the road, we also need ways to assess some of these things and figure out what of these things are actually real. That means like wargaming, exercises, training, model and simulation, everything in between to figure out like, okay, what are the real effects here? What are not? But we need to think broadly and creatively about what the technology means, because certainly adversaries are doing that.
All right, we'll make that the last word. I want to thank my guest, Zach Kallenborn, and I want to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on today's episode of NucleCast. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
What a great episode with Zach Kallenborn. I had never really spent that much time thinking about the role of drones in nuclear deterrence or in nuclear defense until, talking to Zach. So it was really, really sort of insightful to think through where we could go with drones and deterrence, and is it stabilizing, destabilizing? It's a challenging thought, and it's one where there's going to be a lot of creativity and a lot of thought put forth in the years ahead. So hopefully you enjoyed the segment as much as I did. We'll see you next time.